the newsagents.
A new UK-Germany treaty, a once-in-a-generation chance to deliver for working people in Britain and in Germany. A new agreement, a testament to the depth and potential of our relationship, with deeper links.
That was Keir Starmer speaking in Berlin with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, announcing a new UK-Germany treaty focusing on defence but on lots of other issues as well. It was the fifth time in just 7 weeks he's met Scholz, and later today he'll be heading to Paris to meet President Macron for the fourth time.
Yeah, it's all about harnessing the power of government in the service of working people. That is the catchphrase. But what does it mean? There's a lot of talk of a reset in the relationship between Britain and Germany and Britain and France. But is this atmospherics or is this substance? And are we heading back towards the European Union? Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John.
It's Lewis. And for anyone wondering,
it's not.
We're not heading to the EU just yet, or probably ever. But it is notable that, as I was saying at the top, in less than 2 months as Prime Minister, it has been clear from everything the UK government has said, and actually from what the EU has said, that there is certainly a mood in the air, and it might be nothing more than a mood, that there is an opportunity to conduct, as John was saying, a reset in EU-UK relations, which clearly, in the past few years, have been through the mill a little bit, I think it's fair to say.
A little traumatic.
It's a little local difficulty.
It's like after the divorce settlement has taken place,
yes,
you've kind of got divorced. You don't speak, and you're just fuming at each other.
Just send angry texts about the kids now and again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, they're now saying, well, you know what? Occasionally, let's have a glass of wine together.
Yeah, indeed. And there is this sort of sense of rapprochement. And it's not just Starmer either, because there have been lots and lots of bilateral meetings going on, in particular between David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, and John Healey, the Defence Secretary. In any case, Starmer and Scholz in Berlin today announced this UK-Germany treaty, and it is intended to benefit areas, they say, like science, technology, development, trade and business. Starmer calling it a once-in-a-generation opportunity, as John was saying, to deliver for working people. A joint action plan to tackle illegal migration and enhance intelligence on people smuggling. A commitment to Ukraine, quotes, for as long as it takes. Both leaders said there are no new decisions from the UK or Germany in regards to weaponry yet, though. And Starmer has said that the new treaty between the UK and Germany is part of a wider reset that he hopes will be agreed, this new bigger treaty, by the end of the year, or at the latest by spring of 2025.
So we should sort of deconstruct a bit what it is and what it's not.
Yeah.
Because it sounds really ambitious, a treaty between the UK and Germany. Of course, in terms of trade and, any major agreement on that would have to come from the European Union. Germany is a member of the single market, and it is represented by Brussels in any of those discussions. You don't get France or Italy or Spain or whoever doing side deals with other countries. It's all, the problem that Britain had when we left the EU was we had no trade negotiators because trade was dealt with by the European Union, and we had to subtly employ people who knew about doing trade deals. So it's not about that. It is about some of the other things that could improve life without crossing red lines that would signify that we were kind of creeping back towards the EU, creeping back towards free movement, creeping back towards a customs union, creeping back towards the free flow of people from the European Union into the UK and vice versa.
Look, I think it's no surprise at all that the British government and the German government have decided to alight upon defence as the kind of primary locus of this treaty. Because defence is one of those areas which is largely, though not exclusively, outside of the purview of the EU. It is still largely done on the basis of national governments and national policy and national strategic ambition. So what defence does is it basically allows a way in for the UK government to negotiate bilaterally, directly with Berlin. And indeed, there was a precedent for this even before Brexit, which would be the 2010 Lancaster House Agreement that the then Prime Minister David Cameron signed and made a deal with Paris at that time, which was a big Anglo-French agreement on defence cooperation. And the hope within Downing Street is that by getting this not only tonal change but substantive changes on defence, that it might, over time, allow just a few chinks of light in to enhance relations with Germany and France in such a way as that it might allow some wider improvements in trade. But there's another reason to focus on defence as well, which is that now, and it's a big change that's happened only quite recently, it used to be, and it always was, that the UK and France were the biggest defence spenders in the EU. Now it's UK and Germany, because there has been a huge change since the Ukraine war in the German defence disposition. It was always that they were a very low defence spender. They have cranked that up considerably, and the size of their economy is such is that just by maths, if you get to 2.5% of GDP, Germany quickly becomes the biggest defence spender in Europe. So there is a real incentive for both sides, UK and Germany, to enhance an area of cooperation, i.e. defence, that hitherto has been more limited. There's an advantage for Germany as well, in the sense that because they were such a small defence spender historically, actually, as much of the briefing coming from Berlin has said in the last 24 hours, they've got stuff to learn in terms of the UK as such an historic big defence spender can help them ramp up that spending in a way in which is most effective.
And the other area which I think is really interesting is illegal immigration.
Yeah.
Or irregular migration, as I'm seeing it referred to now, as if that's a sort of kind of more euphemistic way of expressing it. Because, of course, the political problems that Keir Starmer has at home, as witnessed by the riots just 2 or 3 weeks ago, and that Olaf Scholz has in Germany with the rise of the AfD party, Alternative für Deutschland, is that you have got a right-wing anti-migrant parties on the rise, on the move, wanting to see solutions to this problem. And of course, one of the net effects of us leaving the European Union was we leave Interpol. It makes it much harder for us to work with Europe on the cracking down on illegal migrants. And this is something that Keir Starmer wants to do. And it is a practical measure. We'll wait to see how much it yields. But this has to be seen in a positive light if you're going to tackle the people smugglers who are kind of, putting these ghastly rubber boats to sea in, somewhere near Calais and sending them across the channel.
Yeah, I think that the big question has to be the one we started with, which is how substantial a reset can UK-EU relations be? And reset is an interesting word because it implies a kind of structural change, I think. It implies sort of moving quite substantially from A to B, or perhaps from B back to A, to where we were before. Now, that is clearly impossible, as long as the Starmer government maintains the red lines that it's had, right? Which is, we're not going back into the customs union. We're not going back into the single market. We're not going to do anything to return to freedom of movement. Those are all three things that Starmer, despite the bonhomie between he and Scholz in Berlin today, reiterated at the press conference. So given that, it is hard to see how you can get anything like a big structural reset. What you can have is perhaps re-energizing relations after years of difficulty, which is, I think, what we're seeing. But bear in mind, Starmer and Labour did go into the election pledging they wanted to lessen the trade barriers between the two sides. That still does feel, given those red lines, to be honest, it still feels like the classic kind of Boris Johnson British government position of wanting to do a bit of cherry picking, of hoping that you will be able to get the EU to move. And although relations have doubtless improved and things have changed since then, time has passed, the Ukraine war has happened, which has reaffirmed and reminded everybody how much more in common the UK and the EU has compared to what divides us. It's hard to see how there can be a big move given those constraints. And bear in mind, when the Starmer government came to office a few weeks ago, what was the first thing the EU said when the UK said that it wanted to see a agricultural agreement between the two sides, that it wanted to reduce the problems that touring musicians and so on have, and all of these things, quite small things in the grand scheme of things, but nonetheless things that the Starmer government have highlighted. The EU's first response was to say, well, before we do any of that, before we discuss any of that, we want to see the current TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that Boris Johnson signed, we want to see that implemented in full. And they sent the British government 8 requests to say, on all sorts of different things, to say, you're not doing enough on these things at the moment, do this first, then we'll talk. So I think we do need to look beyond the vibes and look beyond the mood music and look at the structural imperatives between the two sides that, to be honest, new government or not, have not changed.
Well, let us speak now to Miguel Berger, who has joined us in the studio. He is Germany's ambassador to the Court of St James, to the UK. And it's great to have you with us. Thanks so much for being here. So picking up on what we just said, what does this all add up to?
Yeah, I think it's a part of a broader reset of relations with the European Union, which in our view is really important, given also the geopolitical challenges we are facing. We are very close neighbors, we are democracies, we are sharing the same values, and there is a huge potential to strengthen our cooperation. And, the agreement, the joint declaration which was signed today, lays out now the path for the next 6 months to negotiate a very broad agreement with defense and security at its core, but we want to cover it really everything that has to do with British-German relations, from culture over science, sports, people-to-people contacts, energy. So a broad range of issues where we think that we can do a lot to strengthen our relations.
Let's just imagine there's a newsagent listener somewhere, I don't know, in the Midlands, and they're saying, well, what difference does this make to my life? What's the answer to that question?
The answer, I would say, is that given the situation we are in, this cooperation might affect him or his family in many different ways. I think if we strengthen our security, this is also something important for the Midlands. If we have more cultural exchange, if we have the possibility for people to live and work in the European Union, and also, with youth mobility, young people coming here, there are many areas which touch the life of people.
Master, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about this word that you've used as well, and everyone seems to be using, which is reset. So the government here has prioritised the idea of a reset, a strategic reset, with relations between the UK and the EU. But what does a reset mean? Because isn't the truth that perhaps what we might be seeing is more of a tonal change? But in terms of any big structural changes, the fact is that given the government's position in terms of not changing any of the key parts of the TCA, we're not going to really see a reset in any substantial sense, are we?
I would not be so pessimistic. I think there is really a potential for developing relationships in a much broader way. And I think it makes already such a difference that we are dealing now with a government who doesn't have a problem to speak with the EU Commission, to travel to Brussels, to reach out to the European Union.
Do you think it's significant?
There's an openness in the Starmer government to do that. And we have seen that from day one. After the first cabinet meeting, David Lammy went to Berlin. John Healey went and visited the German defense minister. So I think, yes, there are red lines which were defined by the government. And obviously they are respected, but nevertheless, I think there is a potential to strengthen our relations.
You yourself have identified some of the areas, defence, science, areas of cooperation. Is trade, though, any substantial amelioration to the trading relationship between the UK and the EU? Is that off the table? Because you'll know that in the Labour manifesto, Labour pledged that they wanted to lessen the restrictions between UK-EU trade whilst remaining outside of the single market and the customs union. Is that possible in any substantial sense, do you think?
So we will have negotiations, or at least talks, about the trade and cooperation agreement in 2026. So we have more than a year to prepare that and look into the details. But you are right. Obviously, the fact that there are these red lines limits the possible scope. Excluding a customs union means obviously that certain things cannot be done. Nevertheless, the government has proposed an SPS veterinary agreement, which would in the agri-food sector have a strong impact. And you have asked about what does it mean for the listener in the Midlands. It will affect prices. It will affect the prices in the supermarket if we would have an SPS and veterinary agreement. So there are many areas, despite all these limitations, where I see potential for a stronger relationship.
You said something a moment ago when I was asking that question about how does it affect someone, and you said youth mobility, young people's mobility. Hasn't Keir Starmer explicitly ruled out an agreement which would say, allow a German student or whatever, someone, you know, in their 20s from coming to the UK for 3 years in return for, you know, British student or British young people being able to go to Germany?
I think we are there still really at an early stage of the discussions. And Chancellor Scholz underlined today how important for us this society-to-society contacts are. Student numbers are down 60%, youth exchange, school exchanges are down 70% after Brexit. So there is a lot to do, and it's very important also for your listeners really to understand that youth mobility in the way we see it, and we haven't even started negotiations, in the way we see it, is not freedom of movement, because it would be regulated, it would be based on requirements. It is not migration. It would be the possibility to stay and work for a limited amount of time, and then would people leave again. There are ample possibilities to strengthen our cooperation, respecting these red lines.
Do you think Scholz and Starmer are quite similar characters in some way? I mean, they're both lead social democratic parties. They're both, how can we put it, unflashy kind of politicians, quite workman-like politicians. Scholz might not be there for that much longer, of course, if the current polls are correct, but you think that they would
Lewis,
have
you're trying to say
bonhomie?
Dull. You're trying to say they're both
I
a
wouldn't
bit
be so
dull.
pejorative, John. I was deliberately choosing my adjectives. Do you think that they have a sort of bonhomie because of this?
I would say that they have both maybe made similar experiences, that they are interested in very similar topics, delivering, as the Prime Minister said today, to working class people, the question of respect, how to deal with migration. So there are many, many topics and challenges where Germany and the United Kingdom are in a similar situation. And I think we saw that today at the press conference, the topics they mentioned. They established a close contact, and now since Keir Starmer has become Prime Minister, it was already the 5th meeting they have had. So it shows there is a closeness, and there is the attempt really for a common approach on many policy areas, and I would include migration on that.
Ambassador Berger, thank you so much for coming in. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, John, I have to say, it's really nice of you to worry about the Midlands so much, you know what I mean? Like, you know, it's just lovely. Someone in the media finally takes us in Birmingham seriously. What does Nuneaton make of the German Anglo agreement?
You just sound like you normally do. Are you putting on an accent?
No. Well, I have to put on my posh accent around you and Emily, because I just feel like an oik.
I thought what was really interesting about that is, of course, he's trying to talk up all that has been agreed and trying to make it sound much more substantive than maybe it is. But I think there were two things that stood out to me. One, which is the question you asked about trade, and what difference realistically is it going to make, and is there going to be a new trading agreement? Answer, not really. But he still wanted to push the idea of youth mobility, where Keir Starmer is kind of saying this is a red line, we can't have this. And I think there's a sort of surprise in Europe that Britain is still so resistant to this. I think there's a kind of, what's the problem with this? We're not talking about this being migration where people can come and go freely. We're talking about limited schemes with strict rules where people might come for a year or two, and, you know, there'll be swaps with young people going from here to Germany and Germans coming to the UK.
I think it's a very Starmer position, or Starmer-ish kind of position, to perhaps, and we're seeing it in a few areas, I think, to not realise the political space that he's got on these issues. I mean, and I can understand the skittishness about single market and customs union, because they became kind of talismanic kind of parts of the Brexit debate, and to reopen them would risk reuniting the right in a way, and putting rocket boosters under reform in particular, that, given they're second in so many Labour constituencies in the north, I can totally understand the reluctance. But on some of these more modest issues, which actually I think anyone with common sense could see is not any kind of real political reintegration, particularly with regards to young people, it does seem somewhat perverse, particularly when you consider, of course, that it was young people who were at the forefront, really, of losing many of the rights that they enjoyed in terms of when we left the European Union in the first place.
The other thing that struck me today was kind of, you know, hearing Keir Starmer in Berlin talking about this as being part of the engine for growth, of trying to marry sort of domestic British policy, you know, growth is our number one priority, integrating it into foreign policy. At the same time, of course, as we now know that there is this budget coming at the end of October, which is going to be fairly brutal. Keir Starmer yesterday saying the people with the broadest shoulders must bear the burden. And we've had some of Rachel Reeves out talking today, kind of sort of expanding on that indirectly.
We're very tight on questions here, so let me just ask you very directly, can you rule out raising inheritance tax and raising capital gains in the budget? Can you rule that out, Chancellor?
I'm not going to write a budget 2 months ahead of delivering it. We're going to have to make difficult decisions in a range of areas. On spending, on welfare and tax, we're going to have to make a series of difficult decisions. But I'll set out that detail in the right and proper way on the 30th of October at that budget.
So you can't rule it out?
I'll set out the budget on the 30th of October.
So 3 times there, speaking in Glasgow, the Chancellor refusing to rule out increases in capital gains, inheritance tax, exactly some of the taxes we were talking about yesterday, because given, as we said yesterday, they've ruled out the main levers of VAT and national insurance and income tax, which, you know, raise huge amounts for the government. You are left with not much, and that includes things like capital gains. But the problem is with capital gains, and there is an argument to raise capital gains, which we don't need to get into too much, but about equalising it, the rates between that and income tax, for good reason. But what you can say is that for a government that is saying that its primary objective is wealth creation, that's what Keir Starmer said yesterday. Capital gains is in effect one of the few tax levers that we have. And you can make an argument, at least, to say that increasing it at a time when you are trying to say to the world that that Britain is open for business and we want investment and so on, is a sort of pretty muddled message. Because if you're increasing capital gains tax, which is basically a tax on sort of wealth and profits and in all sorts of share dividends and all those different things, and investment, how can you be at the same time saying that your number one objective is wealth creation?
It's a dilemma that they are in, that they want to have investors, they want to encourage entrepreneurialism, but they need to raise cash. And so many of the obvious ways to raise cash have been ruled out to them because of the way they framed their manifesto.
Except, John, you know, the thing that I cannot get my head around with this first period of Labour government is that we were talking yesterday about the extent to which the Labour under Keir Starmer is kind of regurgitating the George Osborne strategy. Now, I think this is so limiting in so many ways, not least because, for 2 reasons. One, Labour really needs a theory of change, right? It needs to give a direction, as we were saying yesterday, of where it's going. Now, whatever you thought about austerity, and I personally think it was problematic for lots and lots of reasons, but whatever you think about it, for George Osborne, austerity wasn't just kind of something he needed to do in his own mind. It was also his theory of change. Because he was saying, not only do we need to do this, but actually we'll be better off in the end as a result of it, because the state will be smaller and there'll be more space for private investment, for the private sector to grow, because the public sector will be smaller and so on. It was kind of reheated Thatcherism in lots of ways, but it was his theory of change, and it was his way of saying we will be better off at the end of this, even though it might be painful now than we were at the beginning. Labour's not saying that. Labour's not saying, oh, we'll be better off as a result of retrenchment in the public sector or spending cuts or tax rises. They're just saying this is something we need to do. What Labour needs to do is provide a theory of change and say exactly how we're going to be better off. They need to be able to say that we've got an end point and an objective, and right now it doesn't seem to be materialising and it doesn't seem to be anywhere.
We will be back after the break. So we've done UK-EU relations or UK-Germany relations. We should do UK-US relations, because
From Brussels to London to Nuneaton to Washington. All in one
Nuneaton,
show.
I think, a very important part of this episode as well.
Very important.
And also just hearing what your voice used to sound like before you went to the...
It still sounds like it?
No,
what are you
it
talking
doesn't.
about?
It doesn't anything like it. Anyway, before you went to elocution
Your book's all
lessons...
going to Nuneaton, John. I should hope so. More on that later.
More on that later. Look, I think the interesting thing is that I saw in the papers this morning, in the Telegraph, some very authoritative reporting that Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, former EU trade negotiator, is being lined up to be our ambassador in Washington to take over from Dame Karen Pierce.
Well, that'll shut down the cronyism talk.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really interesting about that is because on certain, look, whether it's true or not, I don't know. The Telegraph seemed to report it with some certainty that Peter Mandelson was being lined up. one of the biggest ticket items for the UK and the US is a trade deal post-Brexit, because that didn't happen under Trump. It hasn't happened under Biden, and it is something the UK would still like to see happen. And one person who really knows about US trade is Peter Mandelson.
Do you think that Mandelson could... I mean, the background to this, of course, is that we've currently got an ambassador who's very well respected, Karen Pierce, and
who's come through the traditional channels of being a career
foreign
civil
office diplomat.
servant.
Yeah, she's a foreign office diplomat through and through her whole career. But it's not unprecedented that this particular job could go to a more political appointee. It has done in the past. Ted Heath always wants to. That was always hoping Margaret Thatcher would appoint him there.
Oh, really?
She never did.
Well, under Jim Callaghan, his son-in-law
Yes.
Peter Jay went,
Somewhat
which
controversially.
was somewhat controversially.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not unprecedented, and it is obviously the most plum gig in the whole of the UK diplomatic service. I know you've been hoping for yourself,
it's
John.
got
Of course,
fabulous Lutyens house, the only one in the US.
I'm amazed you've ruled yourself out.
Glorious swimming pool. The tennis court has just been resurfaced. I mean, what's not to love?
But it is obviously a really important job, right? In the sense
Yeah.
that there is no closer diplomatic relationship and security relationship that we have really than the UK-US relationship. It is one of the closest in the world. For all the talk of the special relationship, it's just a very close relationship, right? Because we just have such close kind of intelligence sharing, security sharing. Largely speaking, our geopolitical aims are roughly aligned, although not always. So it's an important job. But obviously the background to it, we've got this ambassador at the moment, but there's been all this talk that maybe it could be Peter Mandelson, maybe it could be David Miliband and so on and others. But do you think Mandelson would be, if Trump wins, do you think Mandelson, could he break bread at Mar-a-Lago with the Trumps?
Let me put it slightly differently. I think it would be absolutely crazy of Keir Starmer to announce who the next ambassador is
right now
until he has seen what the result is on November the 5th
Totally.
of the US election. Mandelson, I think, is a very agile, feline politician who would get on with anybody and probably could get on with anybody. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility of him working with Donald Trump.
Well, part of the Telegraph reporting was saying that Peter's very comfortable rubbing shoulders with the 1%. As I'll say, I think he'd prefer the 0.1%, right? 1%'s a little down at heel.
Peter Mandelson will come after you for having said that. I warn you.
It's a joke. It's a joke.
Well, the other thing I would say is that I think that if it is Trump, I would be very tempted to keep Karen Pierce in place for longer. I mean, she's had a stellar run as ambassador, and obviously it overlapped with when I was there. And even during COVID, she found ingenious, creative, innovative ways to get to see people and get to know people, that weren't breaking COVID lockdown rules, but at the same time meant she could kind of, get to know Washington. And she has managed to keep open, very good relations with the Trump people, with Trump himself. She's been to Mar-a-Lago.
She was the one who got David Cameron into Mar-a-Lago.
Exactly. And she runs a very good operation. We saw her at the Democrat convention last week. She works all sides. And so I kind of think that there would be a merit in keeping Karen Pierce there. And a lot of people have come after her job. I mean, I think Sir Tim Barrow, who was the National Security Advisor, sort of started briefing that he was, bound to succeed her as US ambassador. Hasn't happened.
Sunak pulled it away.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason, again, in a way, this is all part of two sides of the same coin, right? It's all part of the same story, all of this stuff, because it is all part, and the reason something like that ambassador job matters more than it used to, it is all part of what's going on in Berlin today, in Paris, and this story in Washington. I mean, it is all part of Britain still trying to find its post-Brexit role, like where it sits geopolitically, right? Because the truth is, whatever you think about Brexit and whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, and there was arguments on both sides, and whether you thought sovereignty was more important or whatever, I get all that. I think it is undeniably the case that Brexit took place at a moment, or possibly the worst possible moment that it could have done, in one important sense, which is that we decided to bet the house when we left the EU, and the Leave side explicitly sort of spoke in these terms. We bet the house really on being a force for the liberalisation of world trade and free trade. And we would go around evangelising free trade, and we would sign trade deals here, there and everywhere. And that would be an alternative economic model to our relations with the EU. Now, whatever you think about that, it is undeniable that it took place at precisely the moment, pretty much, or just before the moment, where the whole world moved away in a very decisive way from free trade back towards protectionism. It happened with the Trump accession in the White House. That has been continued under Biden. We've seen EU-China relations again characterised by more protectionism all over the world. Actually, what's happened, as opposed to moving towards global free trade, we've moved to ever more to big regional trade blocs. And yeah, there are some exceptions, like we've joined the Pacific Partnership and so on. But largely speaking, that has been the direction of travel. And in between that, little Britain, small Britain, because we're a great country, but ultimately we're 2% world GDP, we have struggled to find an answer as to where we sit. And there probably is no real answer to it, but we've still not been able to find it. And all of this and all of these kind of games that are being played are part of trying to find at least part of that answer.
There's one other thing, and it's maybe a tiny bit, but in managerial terms, if Peter Mandelson or David Miliband got appointed our ambassador in Washington, I mean, it will really piss off the rest of staff in the Foreign Office. Why was it essential that you had this deeply political figure to be appointed? Are you saying no diplomat could have done it? I mean, Blair did it in South Africa with Paul Boateng when he became our High Commissioner there. But by and large, you know, we have a professional civil service that is distant from government, and the Foreign Office works in the same way. So it'd be quite a move to put one of those kind of high-profile ex-politicos into Massachusetts Avenue, glorious though it may be.
Oh, he's salivating. Look at him. He's absolutely salivating, yeah. But perhaps, if not a high-profile politician, perhaps a high-profile, well-connected journalist who has experience of navigating the corridors of power in Washington.
Oh, I wonder who that could be.
Ambassador Sopel.
It's
got a nice ring to it, doesn't it?
I'm just scratching my head thinking if I know anyone who that could
His
be.
Excellency. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.